Welcome and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on day 3 of PRI in person. This conversation will be about physical climate risk and adaptation in a time of increasing climate impacts. We're grateful to gather today on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe since time immemorial to today. Just last night, Hurricane Milton, which could be the worst storm to hit Florida in a century, has made landfall, causing widespread destruction. We hope the loved ones of you all are safe if you and your loved ones are affected. But more broadly, regardless of which disaster or extreme we refer to, the scientific community has been clear that what's happening now in terms of warming is faster than we had anticipated. The World Meteorological Organization, which has the mandate to examine climate variation, has told us that we've, for the first time, passed 1.5 degrees of warming for 12 consecutive months. We've broken all sorts of climate records over the past year, and extremes are being strengthened by a rapidly warming climate in most parts of the globe. So the questions that are on our mind now are, how does this reality that we're seeing unfold, how does that change the conversations on risk among investors? How is our understanding and thinking changing across the community? And how practically are we reshaping the ways that we're approaching investments to deal with this new normal? Joining me to unpack some of these questions and more are a distinguished panel. We have Faith Ward, Vishal, Maria Nazarova-Doyle, and Wren, Laing. Faith is Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel Pension Partnership. Faith, thank you for joining us. Vishal is Head of ESG, Multiples Alternate Asset Management Private Limited based in India. Thank you for being here. Maria, you are Global Head of Sustainable Investment at IFM Investors in the UK. And Wren, you are Investment Director at McConnell Foundation based here in Canada. Thank you all very much for being here and sharing your insights with us. Just before we get into the conversation today that we have prepared, we're going to open a poll to hear from you, our audience, and see what's on your mind. And the question to you is, how are you addressing climate adaptation and resilience in your investment strategy? Are you not addressing it at all? Are you thinking just about physical climate risk? Are you engaging with your investee companies? Or are you thinking already about climate solutions? And so while the answers come in, Faith, let me turn to you. You've been doing a lot of thinking recently and a lot of good work in this area. Increasingly this week and recently, we've been thinking and talking about system-level risks. What does that mean to you, and how is it that investors can begin to understand and act on system-level risks arising from climate change?
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the PRI for the opportunity to talk about this, because I do think it's an area of huge importance, and we do need to sort of up our time and attention on the issue. And as you say, just events, our daily news flow really kind of brings that sort of to the fore. And at the end of it, when you think about, what we're talking about here, physical climate risk, it really is what it is that most of our time and energy around the decarbonisation sort of agenda is trying to stop. And we think about what, from a systemic perspective, it is it's the mother of all systemic risks. And the reason why it is because the impacts that we are experiencing not only sort of independently are problematic, but they compound, they cascade, and they aggregate. So these are, the seriousness with which we need to look at these issues is huge. As an investor, I think it's very much about still building our capacity and the toolkits. I think a lot of the tools that we have at the moment probably aren't giving us all the answers that we need in that area. But we can see from sort of the evidence that it's, this is economically going to be very important. It's going to be very important for investors and for the businesses in which we invest.
Mentioned that these risks compound, cascade, and aggregate. That's a lot of complexity there to grapple with. Any reactions to what the audience are saying? We're seeing the results come in there about how they're already thinking about addressing climate adaptation and resilience. What do you see?
Let's put my glasses on so I can
The vast majority, 60%, say they're already engaging, this is good news, already engaging with investee companies and assets on the company's adaptation and resilience strategy. 4% say they're not addressing this at all. So 96% are thinking about this in one way or another.
I think that's really encouraging. What I'd say is that, and some of the things we'll explore later as to why some of the work that Brunel has been undertaking, is that when we reached out to sort of the asset managers to kind of understand particularly what was happening, we didn't find a huge amount of activity, if I'm honest. So it may be that it's happening in pockets. I think this also varies across different asset classes. Brunel invests in every asset class. So I need, whilst perhaps it's been more obvious in your real estate or your infrastructure portfolios, because those are, it's a bit more tangible. I think we also need to be engaging pretty much across our entire portfolios. So I think, but it's very encouraging if that is the activity that's underway.
Thank you, Faith. Maria, let me come to you. Same question. What is it that you're understanding by system-level risks from climate change, and how is it that investors can begin to act on those?
Thanks, Daniel, and a pleasure to be here. And it's probably important to start by describing what we do at IFM to help you put my answers into context. So IFM is an Australian asset manager, mostly invested in private markets, and we're fully owned by pension funds. So because we're owned by pension funds, we mostly invest in infrastructure, and we invest in infrastructure in an open-ended way, holding these assets essentially in perpetuity. Everything is important. So all sustainability risks are relevant risks, because when you have this indefinite timeline, which is really long, there's not a question of short-term trying to kind of find a short-term gain. So we do think about systemic risks as well as we think about asset-level risks, and climate change is the mother of all systemic risks. It's huge, and we think about mitigation, but also adaptation, particularly if you think about infrastructure assets that are the cornerstone of society. There really is important that we not only decarbonize these assets, but we also shore them up and make sure they're resilient to continue to provide those essential services to society. So we do have the investment thesis that basically, to keep it nice and short, is that only healthy economies can help us derive healthy returns over the long term. And these healthy economies are described by the health of environmental and social systems. So it's very important to think about it systemically for us. And when you look at what's happening, and Daniel was giving us some examples in the world, just last year, about middle of last year, the losses from extreme weather events and natural disasters, they hit $120 billion, which was 46% above the 10-year average. And I don't have this year's stats yet, but I have a fear that they're actually even worse. So the climate change effects are only exacerbating, and they're becoming more severe more often, and they hit in unexpected places. So I think the case for adaptation can be made just on that basis alone. Intergovernmental panel on climate change has suggested that proactive adaptation can severely reduce the losses from climate change, and that makes sense. You prepare early for what might come later, and you actually protect yourselves. But what they also suggested is that the local context is very important. So it's a little bit like think global, act local. You need to think about mitigation across your whole portfolio and all the geographies you invest in, but your interventions and approaches to adaptation should be very different and very asset and location specific. And to me, that makes total sense. One of the issues that I find with that, though, is that it's hard to draw boundaries for your asset. So not specifically maybe the asset, but the boundaries of where your efforts should finish. So a lot of us invest in an asset and we think, well, if that asset is doing well on adaptation and it's investing in it and implementing all these different measures, then it's going to be all right. But in fact, it's not quite like that. It's important to think about the whole ecosystem, about suppliers, about customers, about workers, how they all interact with the asset. So in a sense, adaptation efforts are kind of just as tricky as scope 3, because you need to think about it outside of your zone of direct influence, and just try to think about it as a whole ecosystem and how that might play out. And I'll just quickly mention about what we do. So 98% of our asset value, have already set robust climate targets, and we'll work with all our infrastructure assets to make sure that they have really, really good quality transition plans in place. And those transition plans, they include adaptation efforts, they include just transition considerations, they include nature and biodiversity considerations. So they're very, very much all-encompassing. And then we'll work with assets to help them go up the maturity spectrum, so to speak, of the quality of those transition plans. So something that we feel really strongly about. Again, when you have infrastructure, you can't hide. And if you're an Australian asset manager in particular, you can see those weather effects every day and natural disaster effects. So I'll be happy to talk more about that later.
Thanks, Maria. You've brought out some important concepts there around scale, boundaries of interventions, and tying that back to Faith's contribution about the cascading and the connectedness of these risks. But you've also mentioned that doing nothing is not an option. So facing that complexity head on and beginning to think about the planning and then the interventions is really essential. There's a strong case for that. Wren, let me come to you. At McConnell, how are you facing this new normal? How are you thinking about it, and what's your approach?
Quickly, just a short word on McConnell Foundation. For those who aren't familiar, we're a Canadian private family foundation. And our mission is really to contribute to building a resilient, inclusive, sustainable society that can successfully address its complex challenges. So I'm approaching this conversation today from a philanthropic perspective, but actually more significantly from an investment perspective. Our team is responsible for investing the foundation's endowment in a way that is 100% aligned with our mission. So last year committed to building a 100% impact investing portfolio that's looking certainly not at concessionary returns. We're targeting market rate returns alongside measurable additional social and environmental impact. So when we look at this question of what is climate resilience and adaptation and how does it apply to our portfolio, it's really about that systemic lens on environmental and social change. So in terms of those systemic level risks, when we think of climate adaptation, it's not about the long-term risks necessarily or exclusively. It's about considering the short-term risks and opportunities as well. Climate change, of course, adaptation often refers to the physical risks, but we see these risks interact and compound to be much more systemic in nature. So we can look at Asheville, North Carolina over recent weeks, which was considered a climate haven. But you have this devastating event that not only impacts the environmental landscape of these communities, but the communities themselves in terms of livelihoods, living standards, health outcomes. So when we think about climate adaptation and resilience, it's really from that vantage point of what is that systemic level perspective we need to have, and what are the investment risks, but also the investment opportunities that we can grab hold of to help address some of these more systemic compounding issues attached with climate change. And finally, I would just say in terms of our approach to doing that, as a philanthropic foundation, we're in a unique position to be able to be that connector voice between private sector investors and the government. And we think that collaborative approach to investing in climate solutions across both mitigation and adaptation really involves that collaborative perspective. So that's how we act from a systems level, or attempt to act, is thinking about how we as a foundation can play that connector role across sectors, and how we can look at it from that more systemic social and environmental viewpoint.
Thank you, Wren. I think a couple of things stand out for me there. One is that in focusing on facing this new normal and thinking about adapting and building resilience, it doesn't mean taking the foot off the gas, as it were, on efforts to decarbonize and do what's required. And we're reminded, Maria, you were mentioning the scientific perspective from the IPCC. They made really clear in the 6th assessment report that there are limits to adaptation. So we may adapt to some of what we can see now today. We may adapt to some of what we will encounter at 1.5 degrees, but certainly there's a lot that we can't adapt to, and so it's about doing these things together and thinking holistically and thinking connectedly. So thanks for bringing that perspective in. Vishal, I wanted to bring you into the conversation now. So at Multiples Alternate Asset Management, you're operating out of India. You're perhaps at the forefront of some of these conversations about facing this new normal, about really understanding, assessing these risks, not only from the asset perspective, but at the system perspective. So how are you thinking about it?
Thanks, Daniel. So first of all, thank you, PRI, to having me here as part of this discussion today. When we reflect on the comments made by the fellow panelists, I would want to just give some more background to this context where what are we looking at in terms of climate change related physical risk which the world foresees. So when we look at numbers, these are staggering. There are a lot of reports which says that if we don't act, then by 2050, just the physical risk related to climate can impact the global GDP by to an extent of 10 to 15% if we don't act then. When I try to translate this to Asian context, so I work with a private equity firm based in Mumbai, and we predominantly invest in Indian market. And my role is more about an investment manager and working with our portfolio company and trying to address risk and protect value for all of our investors. So from an Asian context or the overall market in which we play, if I try to look at that from that regional context, it has potential to go up to almost 20% of impact to the whole GDP. Back home in India, the kind of impact which we have seen related to physical climate risk again can disrupt or can have huge implication to the economy. So when we look at stats, almost like 85% of land in India is exposed to different facets of physical climate risk like flooding, cyclones. India is a warm country, so there are long-term models which tell that the temperature rise would be even higher than the current level. So heat exposure is again another set of physical risk. When we look at all of this risk in totality, again it has a huge implication for the economy, which can translate, which can make all of this systemic risk into more of an economic issue, and which can maybe have a deterrent to the GDP as a country as well. What is there in terms of impact to the whole financial system for us as a player? Because we are a private market player, we invest into companies. We would want our businesses to be ready in terms of any kind of risk. And when we say any kind of risk, we have started talking to our portfolio company in terms of how climate can impact not only from a transition risk story, but also from a physical risk. While we talk to the companies, there is always a fallback saying that all of these risks are too long term. You as an investor are going to be there with us maybe max for about a 7 or 8 year horizon. Then why?
That's quite surprising. That's quite surprising to hear that they're thinking that these are long-term risks when a lot of this is unfolding right now, today. How, do you push back on them when they say that?
So what we then say is, see, the role of a private equity or investment manager is also not just about making returns. Of course, making risk-adjusted return is the core of our business. But if you look at the whole role of P in the financial ecosystem, the role of P is also all about strengthening the business. So the business in which we invest, we want those business to be robust in terms of not just financial growth, but also a business which can withstand long-term risk, like climate, a lot of systemic risk similar to climate as well as social related risk. So what we try to go and tell the management is that we would of course want to make returns, but when we exit those businesses, maybe a new investor is coming, that investor also has to have a business which is a sustainable business for a longer term.
So whether they're prepared to face both the long-term futures, which are uncertain, but the short-term shocks and
Yes.
Kind of chronic and acute changes now. So, okay, good perspectives, and thank you for bringing those in. We're going to turn a little bit now to part of the conversation which has been surfaced, which is around the investment rationale for adaptation and resilience, which you've touched on. Just before we get into that, I'm going to encourage our audience to please submit questions. There's a lot of expertise on the panel here. So if you have any questions that you'd like these folks to address, please submit those through the app, and we'll come to those shortly. But turning to the investment rationale then, so I came to climate change through adaptation. I was a civil engineer back in 2008 and 9. Engineers were thinking a lot. The senator on the stage 2 days ago when we opened mentioned engineers have been thinking about this for 20 years because we've been having to face how to make infrastructure more robust to weather the increased water, heat, storms, etc. already. So as we look to the future then, for some of us, we're thinking adaptation's not new. Climate risks have been discussed in different circles for 20 years or so. But it seems like the finance sector is waking up now. It seems like the investment community is really getting it. So I suppose my question now will be around what do you see as the best economic rationale for now incorporating climate risk and resilience considerations in your investment strategy? And I think here, Maria, let me turn to you first. How do you see that economic rationale for acting on climate risk now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Daniel. I think there is a clear economic rationale for investment adaptation. The Global Adaptation Commission, convened by 23 countries in 2018, have found that the benefit to cost ratio for investment into adaptation can range between 2:1 to 10:1, and it's definitely not insignificant. So they've also estimated that if we invest $1.8 trillion into adaptation by 2030, the resultant benefit will be around $7 trillion. So it's nearly $4 of benefit for $1 spent on investment, which I think is quite a decent return on your investment into adaptation. At the same time, the UN last year issued a report estimating the gap for adaptation investment to be around $100 trillion, which is basically the total global market cap. So it's actually quite scary to read those numbers. So I don't personally think we'll be able to cover that whole gap, but there's definitely a case for investment in solutions that are proven to be effective, that are cost efficient, so they're low cost, and that actually can have an immediate effect, like early warning systems for severe weather disruptions, or like flood prevention measures and barriers, or for example, heating and insulation solutions. So they're widely available, very effective, and they help you now, so you can see that business case of investing into them now. In infrastructure, I think it's pretty much a no-brainer. I would describe it as such, because investing into adaptation and improving resilience of assets actually helps you shore up the revenue-generating activity of that asset, which means that it links directly to value generation. So I guess the business case might be different in different parts of the market, but for infrastructure, it's very clear.
Definitely. So different business cases, different asset classes, but certainly on infrastructure, there's a strong economic case for action. Vishal, let me come back to you. How do you see that? Where do you see the strongest investment case for acting on climate risk?
So, as I told you, we as an investment manager invest in a lot of sectors, but broadly sectors which doesn't have much exposure to direct impact from carbon emissions. We invest largely into financial services, healthcare, technology, and consumer as a sector. So these sectors, by sheer nature of their business, they don't have much exposure to the transition-related climate risk. But as I told in my previous response, yes, these sectors are businesses which also have operations across the country. And as I told, India as a country is vulnerable to different climate-related risk, climate-related physical risk. So when we look at all of this investment, different assets of our portfolio companies, if these assets are getting exposed to, let's say, flooding as an issue, it can disrupt production for those assets, which is going to impact the cash flows of this business. And we know that in a growing business or high growth potential business, if there is a disruption like flooding, and if your cash flows are getting impacted even for, let's say, 10 days or 2 weeks, it has a direct impact on your returns, right? Not just for the portfolio company, but also as an investment manager and the returns which we have promised to our investors. So what we see is all of this risk maybe looking from a long-term perspective also is going to impact our investments in future. And if so, as a sustainability or a ESG person sitting into a private equity firm, my role is about talking to my investment team and asking this investment team and portfolio team to acknowledge and recognize this physical climate risk which portfolio companies are getting faced against, and also talking to the management and founders of this company so that they include this risk into their enterprise risk management framework. So what we are talking is expanding the whole risk management framework to accommodate risks which are more emerging risks, right? When we talk about sustainability risk, per se, from a market understanding point of view, it's all qualified as an emerging risk which businesses are going to face. So what we do with our companies is first we ask them to expand the horizon, look at different time horizon, look at different kind of risk, and then strengthen the whole risk management process at their end. And while they do that, we also talk to the finance team. So it is not just about talking to the risk team. Of course, risk sit within the finance team, but also talking to the finance team and asking them to prepare the business, the investments which are required in, let's say, the adaptation related interventions or intervention which can make the business more resilient in longer term. So it's all about talking to different teams, maybe revamping the whole process in which how ESG is getting integrated into our businesses so that the businesses can be there and also generate revenue in longer term for us.
Thanks, Vishal. I mean, you've mentioned there that in the near term, you do see that there will be impacts on returns. That's a strong economic case for action. Wren, do you see that way? Like, you can give us a reality check if we're in a bit of a bubble here. Where is there a strong economic case for action? Where is there not on resilience?
We absolutely see it that way. So it's about short-term risk mitigation, but with the view of long-term income and cash flow and value generation ultimately when you invest in climate adaptation and resilience. So for us, every investment must satisfy our approach to climate solutions across both climate mitigation and adaptation. But on adaptation, thinking about increasing resilience, adaptive capacity of communities, again, and decreasing vulnerability. So that dual perspective, again, on what is a climate solution, but more significantly for today, how does that generate long-term, short and long-term investment value? So it does start with risk mitigation, but then it translates from there into ultimately the financial upside of the investments we're making across asset classes. It's very much a cross-asset class viewpoint. The last thing I would touch on, and there's a really helpful, I'm sure Faith will mention it, the Transition Task Force paper on adaptation and resilience has a really interesting snapshot of the interrelationship between climate adaptation and climate mitigation, and where those two things work hand in hand, also where those two things converge. So being able to invest in climate-proofed renewables, climate-smart agriculture, real estate adaptation, such as natural ventilation, those sorts of investments which both contribute on the mitigation side to real-world emissions reduction, as well as on the adaptation side. That's where the sweet spot in terms of investment opportunities lies, we think.
Loving your emphasis again on the connectedness of the approach that we have to take here. I think fundamentally when we're speaking about system level risks, it's not one thing or the other. And it may be that our exposure leads us to have different emphases, but it has to be that we think about this in a connected way. So thank you for bringing that out. So we've heard then, I think, from most of our speakers, you're seeing, at least in some asset classes, in some areas, strong economic case for action from the perspective of foundations, private equity, institutional investors. Faith, I want to come to you and ask about businesses. So drilling down, why should businesses act on physical risk and adaptation?
Thank you, Daniel. And just to pick up, thank you very much, Wren, for the shout out for the work of the Transition Plan Task Force. I co-led alongside Katie Spooner from the Environment Agency a fantastic working group of people who were tasked to how to integrate adaptation into transition planning. We've heard throughout the conference, I think in every speaker, how important transition planning is going to actually be both for businesses but also as sort of financial institutions. And that primer, which is in the resources on your app, It's 23 pages, it's packed full of resources, packed full of examples. I've drawn extensively on that in my notes today, and we'll share some of that. So I do sort of direct you to that. And that document is primarily designed for those businesses. It's to show them why action today is actually going to pay off in terms of that business case. We want them to be more resilient. We want them to be able to anticipate, cope, and recover from what these are inevitable physical impacts that are going to have. As Wren says, there's massive opportunities here, so we need to capitalise it. And as Vishal says as well, this is a team game. So we need also, it's multi-stakeholder, so there's loads to be when something's that multi-stakeholder, it takes a bit more time and effort. So that's, again, another rationale for kind of actually getting moving today. Just to touch on and pull, if I may, a few of all the different threads that have been shared already. One of the case studies in the primer is highlighting the toolkit, which is called PCRAM, which is the Physical Climate Risk Assessment Model, and it's designed for infrastructure projects, and it helps sort of those people with those, either businesses or indeed sort of asset managers who have got those, to assess kind of what actions and how this might flow into their business cases. And the example it gives of a wind farm in I think Southeast Asia, and it shows that the near-term cost, yes, there is, but actually by taking that cost today, which I think it cost about 2% on there, and it reduced the IRR by about 0.1%. But actually increased the actual benefit that this toolkit was able to demonstrate was actually it was going to deliver that 2% back again, as well as enhanced cash flows. So it's a really helpful tool to kind of encourage you to take action today and actually see the actual that will be a financial benefit in the long run to actually take that sort of action today. And all of that sort of essence of some of that is all contained within that document to kind of help to.
These details are in the document you've referred to.
Absolutely, all of this is.
That's downloadable from the app. So please,
from the app today.
Those 23 pages are gold. Do download those and review those, because it has that very strong business case for action there for companies. Excellent, Faith. Thank you. Good. So, I suppose we've heard across the board then that there's a strong economic case for action. There's a strong investment case for businesses as well. Thanks, Faith. What are the barriers then? Why are we not seeing more action on physical risk and adaptation? Is it about capacity? Is it about expertise? Is it about investors being overloaded with issues to deal with? If it really is material now and worsening soon, what are the barriers that we're seeing? Anybody want to pick that up? Maria, please.
Happy to. So to me, I divide the barriers into three distinct categories, so informational, financial, and policy related. So by informational, I mean, for example, low level of data around climate risks for the assets we invest in and how adaptation investment might help. So just to give you, again, another flavor to it, we have 42 assets. We know where they're all located. But if you're a large investor with more diversified portfolio, just understanding the location of all your assets to then be able to reliably estimate climate change risk and maybe think about adaptation investment is much, much more difficult. So we don't have that level of granularity of knowledge generally in the system yet. But also in financial services, I think we have quite a low level of knowledge about adaptation in general. So we're pretty much all mitigation experts. But on adaptation, we're still not quite there yet. So it's important for all of us to upskill. As we were talking earlier, it's important to do both, and we need to really be confident in doing both hand in hand. So on financial barriers, again, from perspective maybe from an asset owner or a large investor, I think it's around investability and return generation. So if you want to invest in mitigation, you can go invest in the renewables fund. If you want to invest in adaptation, there isn't like an easy way of packaging it to have a specific investment solution, but also it's not easy to actually create a return stream from it. So it's more of an insurance policy. It's a cost that you as a business invest in to try and protect your business operations. But in terms of return generation, it's not quite there. So we probably need to think much more creatively to try and make it investable and figure out how to generate returns. And on policy barriers, I would highlight things like misaligned regulation, kind of misaligned government action. So we'd really need to see the government working together across different departments to try and help adaptation efforts. And at the same time, its uncertainty in policy often hinders long-term investment into adaptation measures. Like in everything else, all investors want is a certainty of policy. So adaptation is not different from anything else that we're thinking about.
So we're not seeing enough action on physical risk and adaptation. You've mentioned there's a need to upskill across our industry. We have imperfect data, but don't let that be a barrier. We can, I suppose, as engineers, rules of thumb can be really helpful as well. So we know, just through an anecdote, in 2009, I was working in Ecuador as a young engineer. We'd been tasked with rebuilding and redesigning a very important critical infrastructure bridge. And the kind of data we used then was to say to the oldest person in the community, what's the highest the water level has ever come? And let's build above that. So you know, there are rules of thumb, I suppose, in the investment world as well, that without waiting for the perfect quantification, we can still understand this is how bad things have been. These are the projections. Let's act with some qualitative even information. As you mentioned at the start, much better than inaction. And then you've also mentioned policy as well. So beyond, I think, upskilling and imperfect data and policy, are there any other barriers to action that we want to mention? Vishal, please.
I would want to add some more thing on what Maria has. So I would just want to build on what kind of barriers we see when we talk to our portfolio companies. Of course, those are complementary to what she told, but if a business has to understand what a physical risk is going to do to his asset in longer term, and we say longer term, it's like 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now. The question what comes up is, how do I know that? And in market, if you go and look for what kind of models can tell whether there is a flooding risk to my business, whether there is a high heat exposure risk to my business, those models are too complicated for somebody to understand. So, of course, what Maria told, expertise in market, at least when I say market from an Indian market perspective, there is lack of expertise or people who can understand this. And that itself will just make the business or a portfolio company say, what am I going to do if I don't understand this whole problem? So lack of expertise is one. About understanding the issue. The second, lack of experts or expertise, what we see in market, which is a barrier, is also, okay, the business will know there is an impact, but if I have to do solutions or intervention with respect to adaptation and resilience, there are no organization who can come and work with the portfolio company to bring in those adaptation and resilience related levers. So that is another set of barriers which we see when we start engaging with our companies. And lastly, trying to build capability and skill set within the organization. So it's not just that I do an exercise now and then I start acting. The business or the teams of the portfolio company also have to be competent and capable to keep looking at newer set of emerging risks within that space of physical climate risk. So building that capability within the portfolio company itself is one of the barriers what we see.
Sure, thanks for bringing that perspective in. Faith, did you want to add?
I wanted to come in because I want to agree with some of what the panel said, and I'm actually going to disagree with some of what's been said. Where I do agree is, I think, in terms of the toolkit, and I think one of the other barriers that we've kind of touched on, and I think actually Maria mentioned it right at the beginning, was that a lot of the tools to assess these risks look at the entity in isolation and doesn't understand the codependency it has on its context. So this is it's the same challenges we have with biodiversity in nature. It's so place-based, and a lot of the tools will go, yeah, no, I'm fine. You know, and there's no like my value at risk models and things like that. But what they're not appreciating is all the infrastructure that they may be dependent upon. It's outside of their control. It's not part of their balance sheet, but they're actually critical to their ability to depend on it. And that's not always modeled in. They can't actually price that because it's like they don't actually, it's not on their balance sheet. So I do think that so some of the models themselves and some of the tools we have are still, I think, not necessarily helping us. I think I'm going to disagree with Maria. Normally we're in violent agreement on most things, but I do actually think there are more opportunities in the adaptation. So I do agree it's trickier than the mitigation in terms of those, but I do think there are loads of opportunities. And again, the TPT primer sets out not only at a business level, so these are opportunities for businesses, they're investment opportunities for me too. It sets out, there's like really the easy wins, where can you actually sort of see investments that can be made that are going to be win-win. So I think, Wren, you pointed out that, like, for example, you could change the conditions within a building actually to meet your health and safety or the working environment of your employees. You might be motivated by making it a nicer, more pleasant environment for your employees, but actually you're making it adaptive to that physical change in temperature rise. So there could be some win-wins there in terms of doing that. So I do think there's lots of things we can sort of identify those opportunities and invest in them. And then you've got things like where you need to be adapting projects today just to make tiny changes so that they are more fit for the purpose for the future. And again, those are, and we need to be asking those questions of all of our infrastructure, all of our real estate projects, and also asking businesses in our listed markets, how are they thinking about their capex, and are they making kind of changes to their construction of their warehouses or their logistics to kind of build in these factors. So I think there's quite a lot of investment opportunity space. It does require a little bit more lateral thinking, so I absolutely agree it's tougher, but I do think we're so much more aware now that that opportunity set's there and we need to deploy that capital, because I think Maria very clearly highlighted the financing gap that's there, and but there is an opportunity for private finance to step in.
Maria, how do you see those
I just
opportunities?
wanted to come in on this. So I think we're probably not disagreeing, because what I'm talking about is, like, if you wanted to go and find a fund that invests in adaptation, that would be quite tricky. It just doesn't really, it's not much of a thing. It's a very new thing. So all these interventions, like we do, for example, with our assets, we invest in adaptation, particular assets. Real estate managers do what you just described with real estate. But for an asset owner to go and say, I want to isolate it as a theme and I want to invest in adaptation, that's the bit that's still hard to find, but that would be helpful in terms of channeling the flow of finance, like we are now doing in mitigation, if we could isolate as an investment opportunity on its own and try to give extra capital. But that's less of a opportunity at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have it as a sort of separate asset allocation, but we already have it as a strong theme in a number of our asset classes, both either, so for example, investing in agriculture in regions where there are pivoting from, say, California almond farming to switching that farming to Europe, where perhaps there is more, there isn't the same stress on water. So that's an adaptation. It's a very conscious decision to invest in something that enables us to pivot because of that adaptation expectation in the future. We've invested in technology, in farming and regenerative agriculture. I mean, a lot of the biodiversity in nature, which we've also talked about a lot over the last few days, and the physical climate risk, that sort of investment opportunity very much often do come together. So I think it's
solutions could be used as one.
Absolutely. So it's starting to come through, I think, as an investment theme, rather than as an isolated theme, but within broader structures.
So I think at this stage, we've covered then the investment rationale. We've covered many of the barriers. We want to get more practical. We want to take the discussion to another level of granularity. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience, so thank you for those. What the audience is really interested in are specific examples of adaptation actions or engagements that you, panelists, have done. What have you engaged on with portfolio companies, with other assets that you hold? What results have those engagements led to so far? What promise do they hold? What does it look like in reality to do adaptation with your holdings? Wren, do you want to pick that up?
I can start. I mean, I think it's an emerging area of practice, as we covered, but there are very specific ways as an asset owner you can begin to embed some of these considerations in your due diligence process. For example, in engaging with prospective fund managers, we do consistently think again about climate adaptation and resilience.
What do you ask them?
So you ask about, for example, if you're considering an infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure fund. That's a classic example, but I think it's a pertinent one, where it's not just about delivering the renewable energy assets, it's about how are these assets climate proofed for the future, and what are you doing on a tangible, practical, day-to-day basis to achieve that. So going into the granularity of what practical solutions are you offering to developers, to companies, if you're on the private equity side, to build in climate resilience from day one? And how does your process embed that over time too? It not just being a one-off risk mitigation exercise, it's a continuous process of how do we embed solutions now in order to see the positive cash flow generations to come.
And presumably asking as well, what is it that you're preparing for? Are you anticipating that you're building resilience for a level of warming of 1.5 degrees, or is it a scale beyond that? What is it that we're preparing for, essentially? What level of resilience are we seeking to build? Faith, you've mentioned some examples, concrete examples of engagements you've done around water and agriculture in California and others. Can you share more with the audience about the kind of the content of the engagements that you are doing to date? What does that look like in reality?
No, super. So those were very much in our private markets, where I think because of the illiquid nature of it, you're going to be kicking the tires in terms of the sort of due diligence. So these things, I say, are slightly more sort of intuitive within that sort of private market, particularly those long illiquid areas. Where we felt that we needed to be taking action, particularly, was in our listed markets space, where and we looked and we reached out, which is why I was probably pleasantly surprised by the results from the poll as to the level of activity that's underway, because when we reached out, we didn't feel that perhaps this was being systematically engaged upon. And as a result of that, we with the support of Kronos Sustainability, undertook to do an engagement program where we tried to create a framework for what are the questions you would ask a company. And we thought we would engage with consumer staples companies, because perhaps, we're all organising with a lot of these, fossil fuel companies and things like that. So this would be like a different topic. So we chose 20 of our sort of largest positions in consumer staples. We chose companies from America, from Europe, and from Asia. So a selection there. But all the companies had in common was they had quite a tangible link to their supply chain. So often they were working with farmers, or they had the potential to make some real on-the-ground impact. So we chose those companies that sort of had those characteristics. And so what we've done is and it's a 2-year program. I've done a short blog that we've pushed out last week just to support this, and we will be sharing more of the work. We don't think we've sort of cracked it or anything, but we just thought it would start the momentum going, and we will be sharing the outcomes of the framework that we've developed when we're actually iterating all the time, because we're learning. As you say, it's very much about capacity building. So to start with, what is very encouraging is actually the questions we've been asking the businesses are very much old school stewardship questions. So, has the board got oversight? Has the board considered the sort of aggregate physical climate risks that its business is looking at? And the answer has largely been no. To be honest, that's the summary. There's been very few examples of where there's been like a systematic thoughtfulness about it. We have seen the fact that these businesses, they're consumer staples businesses, they get climate risk to a lesser or greater degree, but they're seeing it very in operational silos. And we felt that actually that wasn't really what I needed to be seeing in terms of that sort of governance. So we followed very much like a TCFD, TNFD type framework. What was the governance controls and the reporting and the KPIs? What was the strategy around it? How were they thinking about it from risk? And then what the metrics and targets were. Now, the metrics and targets we knew would be the least developed, because I think we all know that this is a tricky area to go. But it's been really productive. Some of the key takeaways has been the positive receptiveness of those companies. So sometimes engagements can be a bit, can not always be the friendliest of conversations, but actually I'd say that there was an understanding on both sides that we were both learning, and that we very much framed it as a kind of a partnership sort of exercise. We were able to share the TPT adaptation primer with these companies, also resources on particular scenarios that they might find helpful. So we've almost been sort of consulting and supporting them at the same time, learning from them. So there are some examples of best practice. I would point you to one of the calls we had with Danone. They have some brilliant stuff that they've put out on their website of dashboards of how they've talked with their farmers and how they're monitoring at a very granular farm level about what the farmers are doing and some of the performance improvements that are happening on the ground in terms of adaptation, but also biodiversity aspects as well. Because obviously, I say these two, the project sort of brought the two themes together. So we will be sharing more over time with that. But I would say please start asking these questions about what is the board oversight, not just are you doing a scenario analysis and coming up with some random number that might not actually be that helpful. How is it actually changing the board's thinking around its sort of long-term capital allocation and business strategy. So I think there's a lot more to be done, and it is a bit of a call to action to get there. And hopefully with things like the primer, you can be quite equipped to have that conversation.
Okay, so good work on sharpening the kind of questions in engagements and having better dialogues there. That's very productive. Taking it a step further, Maria, I want to come to you and ask you, I suppose, in practice, addressing physical risk through investment solutions. What does it look like for you to allocate capital towards adaptation solutions? What are you learning from that experience?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to give you a couple of examples of practical investments or actions, around adaptation from our assets. So I'll give you one from a port and one for an airport. So a port example would be Port Kembla, which is part of New South Wales Ports near Sydney in Australia. And in 2022, the area was hit by the worst flood ever recorded in Australia. And miraculously, the port itself was actually not damaged and not flooded, but all the infrastructure around it, so that the customers of the port used to deliver and retrieve goods, it was basically all in tatters. So that's, going back to my earlier point around the boundary of an asset, and then you have to think, and that Faith was also talking about, you have to think about beyond just the asset. The asset was absolutely fine, but it couldn't function. So at first they kind of thought quickly on their feet, and they started using the Sydney Metropolitan Rail Network, which kind of wasn't built for that, but they could use that to shift goods. But then subsequently, very quickly, there was a landslide in addition to all the floods, and it basically just decimated the rail network. So the port was completely stuck. So since then, in the last 2 years, we've worked with them to improve the kind of disaster continuity and business management plans. But also the port is now a very active advocate with the government for improvements and upgrades to the rail network in disaster-prone areas. So not just around where they are, but for kind of systemically around the country as well, because they're starting to think much wider outside of the asset. And an airport example would be one of Brisbane Airport, which is based in Queensland, which is the most disaster-prone area in Australia. And it basically borders right onto the ocean. So it's fully accepted that flood risk and cyclone risk is just what the airport has to bear. So recently it was expanding and building a new runway. So we worked with the airport to do some very sophisticated analysis and scenario analysis and kind of stress testing to understand which parts of the airport are actually most kind of at risk of floods and weather damage. And at the same time as this was a CapEx program to expand the airport, it became an adaptation program to change, upgrade, and improve the infrastructure that was found most at risk going forward. So it helped really shore up the airport for the future, while accepting that flood risk still remains.
You mentioned there, you've got floods, cyclones, different stresses. I suppose a key question must be, what is it that we're preparing for? Does that enter those conversations when we're building resilience and we're enhancing infrastructure, the ancillary infrastructure around? How do you think about what is it how bad will things get, and on what are we planning for 20, 30, 50 years into the future? How does that factor into your thinking?
Yes, that's exactly what stress testing is. So kind of keep moving the handle up to see, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? Of course, at some point, you just don't have an airport anymore. But or if that's where mitigation efforts need to come in. So
once more, limits to adaptation. We can adapt to a lot, but not everything. Yes. Excellent, thank you. Vishal, let me come to you. Any concrete examples that you can share for investments in adaptation solutions, in overcoming physical risk? What does it look like to you?
Yeah, so I'll try to respond in two parts. One is how have we made changes in our investment process, and what are the kind of engagements we have done with few of our portfolio companies. So in the first part, like Wren mentioned, we have revamped the diligence process. So the way in which we look our investment, we have integrated not just the transition risk, but also physical climate-related risk as part of our diligence process. So when we look at an asset, we look at a site if there is a site which has any likelihood of this impact, and also impacting the cash flows in future. So one example is we were looking at a logistics firm, integrated logistics firm very recently, and one of the site when we visited, the land parcel was the way in which it was built, the adjacent land parcel was at a certain height. So naturally, this land is going to be impacted if the rainfall is going to be high for this. Higher rainfall is going to be there in this region. So we asked the potential company, what are your plans if at all the rains are going to be high? Then how are you going to protect this warehousing facility of yours? So this is a good example of at the time of diligence, we were able to identify one site which has a significant contribution to the cash flows of this business. The second thing what we did is, so as a firm, we have developed a framework on safety and health in terms of how it has to be addressed for our portfolio companies. What we have started doing now is extending this conversation of not just employee health and well-being and safety, but also trying to see how the safety of people who are working in those facilities are going to get impacted from any physical climate risk. So you extend the definition of safety to extending to looking at any unsafe scenarios for employees who are working there. So we have revamped that whole framework of this, and we call that as Suraksha, which is it's a term in Hindi, but it's all about making your assets and people safe and secure for future. So that is a framework which we have extended to all of our portfolio companies. On the second part of engagement, two specific examples I would want to lay here. One is we are investors into a healthcare business, and couple of their assets are assets which are prone to flooding as well as scarcity of water linked to maybe lower rainfall. The same set of assets has both the type of risk which we foresee. So what we have done is we have engaged with the management. We have asked them to make investments into adaptation. So at the scenario of flooding, we have looked at the stormwater drains. We have asked them to just redesign and maybe beef up the stormwater drain so that a flooding related risk can be minimized. In a scenario where rainfall is going to be low and there is going to be scarcity of water, what we have told this company is to invest into rainwater harvesting so that it can collect rainwater which is going to be there during the rainy days, and that water can be used during a water scarce period for this business. In terms of resilience, what we are saying is when we look at resilience, we also extend it to value chain. So it is not just the asset has to be resilient, but there could be risk in the value chain. The suppliers and stakeholders who are working with this particular company, those value chain partners could also be exposed to physical climate risk. So we are we have talked to this company and asked them to look at any risk which is there in their value chain or no.
Any of the investors that we speak to are focusing right now on beginning their efforts on locational specific risks for assets, for real assets they hold. But you touch on those value chain, those supply chain risks. That's complex to assess and monitor. Like any specific tools or approaches you want to mention that you think are working? What are you learning on that?
So we have subscribed to one tool which is available, proprietary tool, which is a GeoSys tool, which looks at high level in terms of physical climate risk, whatever is spoken in terms of flooding, heat exposure, cyclones, and it also looks at biodiversity related. If the sites are having any IUCN red list species which are there. So we have subscribed to this tool, which we give access to this tool to a portfolio company, and through that we are trying to also give access to the value chain company so that they could look at those risks. One more example, maybe I'll just have one more example is one of our investment in animal healthcare business. They have their product which is predominantly coming from an inorganic route, but they recently have acquired a business which has 100% product portfolio coming from forest-based raw material. And when this company of ours was looking at this acquisition, we, at the time of diligence, with the help of the CFO and finance team, we asked them to look at all kind of possible risk to the key raw material and whether the future implication on cash flows is going to be there. And there we saw that if this impact are going to be real, then the cash flows are going to be to get impacted. So there again, we worked on ways of sustainable farming, also engagement with local communities, forest conservation, all those kind of interventions were weaved into the environment and social action plan which we have built for that investment.
Okay, so we've touched on some real examples there. I hope we've got into some of what the audience wanted to cover. We've touched on ports, airports, water, agriculture. Our audience, I think, based on the questions coming in, remain a little bit unconvinced about some of the investment case. So let me fire a few questions at you and just jump in if you want to contribute here. So a couple of questions here. How do you make the business case to address ecosystem risks and opportunities from adaptation if the typical institutional asset hold is 5 to 7 years at best? And another one I'll fire your way is, what are the key sources of repayment you're seeing on adaptation projects? So unlike mitigation, solar energy generates revenues. Adaptation projects may not have direct sources of cash flow for repayment. How does that affect the business case?
I can certainly touch on a shorter term debt fund example of where adaptation comes to the fore. And it's again within the infrastructure space, but I think it's interesting because it's a bridge debt fund that we recently committed to where, of course, the holding period, for the fund is 6 to 36 months. It's bridge debt. But despite the short holding period, they still have a tangible material impact on what the developers do in those initial stages of development of these assets. So onshore wind and solar, they're thinking about assessing climate risks in terms of course, cold, rain, flooding, as part of the due diligence, but then continually thereafter. So looking at parts of Europe and OECD in particular, specific examples in Eastern Europe where they would look at freezing pails as a huge recurrent issue in certain geographies now. And how do you use the diligence process in those early phases of debt financing to ensure that the developers are putting in place mitigation efforts to prevent the pails from breaking should they freeze. So working with AXA Climate is their approach to assess these physical risks and then to engage with investees to mitigate them. And that really does pay off in the short term, right, in terms of the risk mitigation generating additional cash flow in the long term. But that's, again, a short-term bridge debt example of where mitigation and adaptation needs to be front and center in some of the decision making.
Thanks, Wren. There's another one that's come in that's taking a global view. The question is, it's one thing to assess adaptation risks, as we've discussed, but how do you see the global investment market for adaptation solutions? Is there a global investment market for adaptation solutions? Of course, we mainly see mitigation solution investment cases, but very few investment cases on adaptation solutions. What do our panelists think?
I mean, I think sort of picking up a little bit on what sort of the debate that Maria and I were having earlier, I think it's because it can appear in many different ways. I don't think it kind of necessarily just sits in perhaps in another sort of more traditional thematic way in which we might explore investments. So it might be more to do with sort of technical infrastructure. So it may be just identifying kind of what are the sort of shapes or changing demographic needs, and therefore what is, and that might itself be a result of sort of adaptation. So even sort of the sort of technology or ability to kind of work remotely, that is an adaptive investment. The fact that, I mean, if our office is inaccessible due to, I mean, I don't know about you, but I regret now that no snow days are no longer an option. I get to work from home. You no longer have the, oh dear, we're all even the kids have to log on and do their lessons online. So no more snow days with things closed. And that is adapting to changing kind of ways of working, and that requires sort of telecommunication kind of and sort of more network. So I think it's more of a thinking about it more laterally. It can be built in as Maria clearly indicated in terms of it's the design of some of your infrastructure. So some of it's just about smarter thinking. So I think the business case is the fact that if you don't do it, the impact is you could wipe out entire values of entire assets. So I think that the business case does come more from looking at that vulnerability and that sort of that capacity, and that's what the tools like the PCRAM are designed to do, is actually to provide that piece of toolkit that allows you to evaluate, assess, create the KPIs, actually build it into your financial models and work out how does that actually look and actually see that sort of payback and when it might be. And so to properly assess it, I think.
So an investment case of adaptation based primarily on avoided losses, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is still also, I mean, we're investing in technology that reduces water consumption in agriculture. Well, the societal sort of license to operate with a lot of these things are changing. Permissions with companies to operate in certain areas that are either industrial or sort of agricultural are dependent on, and if they're highly dependent on water, and we're getting areas where there's conflicting demands. If you can be the organisation that only requires a fraction of that water in order to produce the same product, you've got a competitive advantage. So I think we do need to think slightly more smartly. It isn't quite as obvious as kind of let's just go and invest in a solar panel or wind farms in that sort of energy sort of area. It does require a bit more thoughtfulness, but I think it needs to permeate everything that we do in all our asset classes.
And Maria, you've mentioned some specific examples of solutions in Australia. Do you see a global market for adaptation solutions?
I see it developing, and we definitely need to develop it. And I think sort of what me and Faith are trying to say, that there's stuff happening, and it is kind of investable, but it's maybe not quite packaged. And I think if we can do a call to action, maybe a bit too early in our panel, but call to action to asset managers in the room in terms of product development. Think about, can you actually identify those strands that are maybe already included in your sustainable food and water fund or sustainable agriculture fund, or can try to maybe package them up as standalone adaptation investments. I think that would be quite an interesting theme that a lot of asset owners would like to explore. And at the same time, I do acknowledge that a lot of this stuff is essentially public good. So I think there's space for innovative thinking, working with governments, so public-private partnerships, those sort of collaboration to try and kickstart the investments where it's needed.
There's a lot of new knowledge emerging, and thank you, Faith, for highlighting the kind of open source nature of many of the studies that you've been part of. So there's a lot emerging, and it's moving quickly. I want to touch on a couple more themes coming through from the audience. Insurance. Can we share any examples of working with insurers to support the business case for investment in adaptation measures? Anybody? Okay, then tools.
Well, I'll pick up on the fact that
Faith,
I think
go ahead.
the insurance industry has been working on this for ages. So, and there are lots of multi-stakeholder sort of forums that are bringing through guidance. There is a huge amount of research. A lot has come out this year, so it's quite fresh in terms of looking at. And the assurance and reassurance industry have been quite actively involved, and they're actually providing for us as investors some of the most substantive case studies, the evidence. So actually working in partnership with the insurance industry is absolutely critical. Partly because they've been live to this risk for quite some time, so they're a fantastic partner, and they've been providing input to a lot of the work and research that you're seeing out there. So,
absolutely, great.
Just to add to that unfortunately a lot of areas now quickly becoming uninsurable. So part of adaptation efforts and adaptation investment could actually be relocation of activities, relocation of assets.
For sure, thank you. There's some questions coming in, a couple of questions on tools that you're all potentially using. So can the panel point to any tools that investors can use to assess, integrate physical climate risk into your investment process? There's another question here around, is it a problem that there's a long time between updates of commercial physical risk tools? Is that problematic? And is there a role for open source tools like the OS Climate Physical Risk and Resilience tool, which is frequently updated with respect to hazards, data, and models? Could that be a solution to the problem as well? So tools, what are you using, and what are we learning there? Vishal, please.
For my past experience, I can say that, of course, there are complex models which you can subscribe to, but then you will have to pay. But then in past, what we have done is there are World Bank tools which are openly available for you to, in terms of information, it may not be so granular and accurate, but then at least it can tell that, okay, in a region or a province, a kind of risk related to flooding in which my asset is operating you can decipher that by using those publicly available tools. But definitely there is lack of tools available in market which can tell long-term physical risk to your businesses and assets.
Okay, work to do there. Anybody else want to comment on tools you're using and what's valuable?
I've mentioned PCRAM, which is very specific, I think, to sort of infrastructure projects. We use, like I think most of us use a sort of data provider to provide that sort of those analyticals at a high level. I think those still have some way to go to be as useful, if I'm honest, and that's not a criticism of the data providers, but just more that, so what? What do I do with this quite slightly random number sometimes? But what it is doing is stimulating some of the more qualitative conversations. So I still think even having numbers, even if we know that they're imperfect, we're getting lots of developments on GIS and sort of that sort of satellite, and that's really enhancing, I think, our sort of understanding and some of that real-time kind of data. And as you say, there's lots of developments sort of in the open source area. For businesses, if they're looking, there's quite a lot of resources in that engineering space. So I think there is sometimes space or in the government area. So the UK, US, I think in Europe, have all got basically climate plans that you can use as like a risk framework. You might be more familiar with these, Daniel, that can help you to start that assessment. So there you can look at what they're doing kind of at a national level, and they give you some good indicators and frameworks for sort of risk and thinking about that more broadly. In that regard. So there again, I point you to the very freely available TPT adaptation primer that also has lots of resource links. It's just full of hyperlinks to kind of point you in different directions. So please go and have a look at that. But
good. Thank you, Faith. So we've covered a lot in the conversation so far. We've discussed how thinking is changing across the sector, the case for action for institutional investors and businesses. We've covered some of the solutions that you're all working on, and some hard questions about how things are evolving in terms of tools, the progress that needs to happen. I suppose my final question to you all is what needs to happen now? We're in 2024. We're seeing record climate impacts. Many of us around the world, but even in the US, just south of here, are seeing devastation from the impacts already, which are enhanced, which are strengthened by climate change in a rapidly warming world. What is it that institutional investors ought to be focused on in the next couple of years and in the remainder of this decade? What are the one or two things that we ought to be focused on as a community? So in 30 seconds, Vishal.
Few things from my side. One is, I think you, as a PE or also you need to build capability to understand this risk. So building capability of your team as well as trying to see that the portfolio company teams also understand this kind of risk. So that is the first thing. The second thing is also to do a quick scan of your entire portfolio and see where does this risk lie. I think these are low-hanging things, low-hanging actions which you could take. And the last one, of course, is you look at your risk tool and see that physical climate risk gets become integral part of that tool.
Maria, to you. What do we do next?
So I've prepared two, but actually we've designed the third one, right, as we were talking. So the first one would be, call to action in terms of developing adaptation solutions, trying to package them up if they're already developed. The second one would be around upskilling and actually starting to price in adaptation costs better. So whether you're asset owner, asset manager, you can either do it yourself or ask your asset manager how they're thinking about it, but it really needs to be embedded into the thinking. And too many and too often short-term investors, they price these risks to zero, and that's not true. And we know that. Look at North Carolina just a week ago, right? So these climate effects are everywhere, even where they never used to be. So it can't be zero, and we need to be better at pricing it in. And last but not least, around policy advocacy. So we're talking about policy being a barrier, but also it's a fantastic lever to actually unlock action. And my personal favorite is introduction of minimum resilience standards. So we talked earlier about how it's a public good oftentimes, and it's not really investable, but policy can put that, create the level playing field and actually demand minimum standards for resilience from assets, from buildings and so on. And that would really help businesses focus their attention on it.
Faith, what is it for you? What do we do next?
Ensure that adaptation is built into the transition planning activities of the businesses in which you are and assets that you're investing in. So insist that those components are there so we can get that transparency and flow of information as to what's happening and how the companies and the assets are managing those runs effectively. And mirroring Maria's point, actually deliver on the Sharm el-Sheikh kind of adaptation agenda. We need governments to have adaptation plans, but actually also deliver them. We've got some great plans, a bit less on the implementation and delivery, but follow through with our sort of policy engagement to say, no, we need this comprehensive plan and deliver it.
Wren, where does our community put its focus? Final word?
I think in terms of just shifting the conversation, not only to be about risk, but also opportunity. So again, where are the win-wins? Most of us are focused almost predominantly on, if not exclusively, on climate change mitigation. Where are the opportunities for adaptation, and where do you see these two things converge into investment opportunity, not exclusively risks?
Thank you, Wren. Excellent. So look, we've had a great conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I think one thing is clear is that the way that the finance sector is thinking about physical risk and adaptation is changing, that there are clear ways that we can think about decarbonizing and mitigating, as well as handling and understanding and dealing with the risks that we're facing now and that are likely to worsen. There are many ways that investors, companies, and governments can all contribute to getting this right as soon as possible. There's a lot that needs to happen. I want to thank our audience for participating with your questions. I want to thank all of our speakers, Vishal, Maria, Faith, and Wren. Please join me in thanking our panel, and thanks for joining us.